Hey guys, welcome to book review 122. Today I am going to be reviewing The Social World of Batavia by Gelman Taylor. This is sort of a more academic look at European society within Indonesia, specifically Dutch society within Indonesia, basically from its founding in the early 1600s all the way to the end of Dutch colonial times in the 1940s. Um, Specifically, it doesn't really focus on Indonesians or Indonesian society. What it really focuses on, though it has aspects of that, what it specifically focuses on, as the title would mention, is Batavia, which is now known as Jakarta, the capital of Dutch Indonesia. And specifically, as the title says, the social world. How sort of the powerful interacted, the middle class interacted, as well as sort of the larger underlings that you commonly see in colonial societies interacted. Well, I guess I should go through the periods first. The first period is the 1600s. This was when the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company, controlled Indonesia, so it wasn't directly controlled by the Netherlands. And it was primarily used as a trade output. I get the sort of sense from the book that during this time period, it was really sort of the Dutch East India Company only kind of had a foothold within Indonesia. It's not that there was really a unified force that was preventing the Dutch from colonizing Indonesia, as it was just sort of the parameters of how far away Indonesia was from the Netherlands, how I won't say primitive, but early the transportation technology was, that really Dutch control of this area was tenuous. It wasn't necessarily challenged, but it was tenuous. Um, Excuse me. So early in this time period was when sort of the trend that only in the late 1800s and early 1900s was broken. And that being that the very, very cream of the top, like the governors or whatever, of Batavia, of Dutch Indonesia, would marry Western women, or occasionally Eurasian women, Eurasian being mixed race women who are recognized as, or who is raised as Europeans, even though they have Asiatic blood within them. The other sort of groups that are defined in this, there's Europeans. Those are immigrants who are raised in Europe, in that society, came to Indonesia. They're the Europeans, or people even, I believe, that were raised in Indonesia under European conditions, or maybe were born in Indonesia, raised in Europe, and then came back to Indonesia. The second group was Creoles. Creoles are white people, white Dutch colonizers of Indonesia, who took on more of the Indonesian role. They would never see the Netherlands. They were still considered sort of like a upper echelon group within Dutch East India. The third group was Mezzos, who are, I gotta get this right. No, it's Eurasians are above Mezzos. Eurasians are the ones that are of a union of a Dutch father and a Asiatic or Indonesian or sometimes Chinese import, but primarily Indonesian mother, who were raised and recognized as 100% um, European. Culturally, they were European. Now, they weren't really, but in the sense that the whole of Dutch East India was not really a representation or a recreation of Europe. It had its own sort of unique culture, but to the people that were in charge, to the degree that they were raised as European. And then you had the Mezzos, who were often kind of the lowest group that had some sort of involvement with Europeans, particularly by blood. I mean, there were a lot of people that were purely Indonesian that had some sort of interaction, but were not necessarily by blood. These people were often not recognized as sons, considered illegitimate sons, illegitimate daughters, and they kind of formed the buffer zone uh, between Indonesian society and the Dutch colonial rulers, who really I felt sort of took outside of the business of making money for the Dutch East India Company and later as private entrepreneurs, really took a hands-off approach in um, the education, just in not just the education, but in interaction in general with Indonesians. Um, so yeah, that was those were kind of the groups. And then you had the tenuous hold in the 1600s. In the 1700s was when it was sort of the height of mezzo culture, in the sense that while the very tippy top tended to be purely European, there were people that rose to prominence that were of mixed race. Um, Now, this sounds like it's a great thing, but there was still very sort of this stratified layering by ethnicity um, that was, well, I mean, it was what it was for the time period. I guess that's sort of from a modern point of view. But yeah, it was definitely sort of, you could rise uh, to degrees of importance, but you couldn't rise to like the ultimate degree of importance, or like even like the top sort of clique was still largely European. Now, the reason this was because outside of the very, very top cream of the crop that truly controlled the colony, uh, the majority of people within the society or had a unique relationship to one another, sexual ethnically or marriage ethnically. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. But unlike the English or some other era people, they did not promote settling of married couples. They primarily promoted young men from the Netherlands, a lot of times poor soldiers, not necessarily, not high society. Basically, like soldiers now nowadays. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Really want to say that, but soldiering has never exactly been the form of the elite, if you will. So they would send them out to Indonesia, and they would predominantly marry women who would be of Asian descent. The sons would often be sent back to Europe, whereas the daughters of these relationships would marry again the next generation of white settlers that would come back to Indonesia, uh, the next round of soldiers or whatever. Um, so you were able to see this trend continue, and interestingly enough, sort of power ties or clan ties were not landed gentry. They were not necessarily through the son. What they really were through the husband of the daughter. And so it wouldn't even be by blood, but because the trust was through ethnicity, through a white person to another white person, or Dutch white to another Dutch white. Really, that's how society worked for a long period in Indonesia, or Dutch Indonesia. There were a couple events in the early 1800s. The Napoleonic Wars led to France taking over the Netherlands, at which point Britain, with its large naval fleet, occupied Indonesia. This led the Raffles family to, if not really change society, at least put the kernel of thought that society should change. This also corresponded a few years before with when the Dutch East India Company essentially became bankrupt and the Dutch Indonesia was controlled directly by the Netherlands. At which point there was more if a sort of condescending, still sort of race-based narrative, at least there was some sort of discussion of what is ultimately humanitarian rather than just kind of have this very stratified society. Um, to give a specific example, I really feel in the 1700s. In the 1600s, the book, to its detriment, largely just gives genealogy, which might be partially because there wasn't a lot of recorded historical data from this time period. But in the 1700s, you really start getting an idea of what domestic life was like through personal accounts. Uh, and so during this time period in the 1700s, you would have women that would be considered aristocratic but didn't know how to read Dutch and had hundreds of servants but didn't have any idea of the rights of man, etc., etc., etc. Basically, like, even though it wasn't private enterprise, it was largely run by the Dutch East India Company. I consider it sort of like the plantation mentality of like, well, if everybody knows their spot, then everything is okay. But it's a largely stratified society. So anyway, the British put a grain of kernel of some sort of change, in this mindset. Not necessarily attacking the stratification, but sort of attacking the difference in what it thought of its own society, which of course it thought was superior, because that's the Dutch, or that's the excuse me, thought it was superior. Rewind. Thought it was superior. That is the English in their colonial rule. And so what you see throughout the 1800s is sort of a slow, gradual uh, kind of change that eventually led to mezzo society and sort of this kind of mixed society, if you will, largely being seen as pastiche. Um, the Dutch obviously still took advantage economically where they could, but a lot of the power source was coming at this point because technology had advanced directly, transportation technology, etc., communications, the telegraph, etc., 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 was largely being dictated directly from the Netherlands. This sort of mixed society that was kind of able to exist on the very fringes of the known world. I don't know what you want to call it. At that point, kind of still very much existed, but was seen more as a lower class existence rather than sort of the height of culture and really in the powers of halls of power, if you will. Another way they extended is they extended out to private. This is in the 1800s, out to private entrepreneurship in the countryside. You see a lot of people that no longer associate with government politics, that are no longer associated really with Batavia, but are sort of kind of within the kind of like suburban. I don't know what you put it, or even like areas that are economically interact with Batavia, but on the plantation themselves, and the sort of semi progression that's going on in Batavia. But on the plantations themselves, largely exist as like little Batavias that would have existed 150 years ago, with a lot of the intermarriage. And it's not to say that intermarriage is bad. I think I gave that wrong impression. But it was the intermarriage that very specifically put the white male in the power spot and put the uh, Indonesian woman, not just because she was an Indo woman, but specifically because of her race, definitely in the lower spot. And, I think we largely views that as non-progressive today. Um, Sort of the book ends with with the uh, kind of this was truly falling out of power in the 20th century, and Indonesia was just largely ruled directly by the Dutch. Colonies around the world were kind of becoming decolonized. I guess that's the word you use. Uh, there was certainly pressure on the Dutch to do that. This is in part because you're successful, then people will rebel. You can't have both a society that is enlightened, which European like to see that it was, with the rights of man, and also have colonies, and then try to educate those colonies, and then not expect the people within those colonies to have some idea of independence or rights, etc., etc., etc. Though really the christening event was World War II. This kind of mixed up uh, the last throes of the traditional power structure within Indonesia, to the point where the Japanese viewed the Dutch as the Dutch and everyone else as Asians. Um, at which point, shortly after the war, I think it was 1949, Indonesia gained independence, and that was the end of Dutch rule within Indonesia. So I'm not sure I did the greatest of jobs, but I tried to explain it. The Social World of Batavia by Gelman Taylor. All right, keep checking out the reviews, you guys. Bye.